I'm sure you may have heard the secrets of Freemasonry before. If not, they're all available online. Secret handshakes, secret words, secret rituals. But I bet no has told you the real secret. Something I never saw coming. In 2019, my entire life took a turn that I never could have imagined and that I have never been able to forget. At the time, I was working in procurement at the respected engineering firm Black & Veatch, quietly managing my own struggles with minor depression and anxiety that had followed me for years. Even though my grandparents, my mother, and her close friend all sat me down and warned me not to do it, I made the decision to join the Freemasons anyway. I genuinely believed at that moment that they were a group of good men dedicated to self-improvement and helping their community, and that belief felt honest and hopeful to me. I became a member of the Overland Park Masonic Lodge located at 8109 Overland Park Drive in Overland Park, Kansas. Among the men I met there were Rick Stauffer, Doug Jessup, Callum Martin, a man named Perry, another Doug, a Fred, Angelo Mino from Lenexa, who later passed away from cancer, Daniel Helm, and several others whose names I still remember clearly. These were just some of the men who would go on to play a direct role in the torment that followed me for years afterward. Not long after joining the main lodge, I also became involved with the Rosicrucians, which is a known sect of Freemasonry, and I attended the Order of St. Martin a couple of times, though I never learned enough about it to speak on it in depth. Right after I joined, I filled out an application to the CIA, but I never received any response. Later, one of the voices I heard actually said to me, "This is you. You found our recruiting method." And that statement has always made me wonder whether the Masons, or even Black & Veatch itself, had some kind of hidden connection to that world. Not long after my initiation, I went to a local car wash and watched two men dressed entirely in black button-down shirts, black pants, black belts, and black shoes walk out of the manager's office, pass directly behind me, and disappear into another room. The manager then said something strange about me wearing orange, which felt like a coded reference to prison uniforms, and that moment has stayed with me as one of the first clear signs that something larger and more orchestrated was already in motion. The night of my initiation remains burned into my memory with perfect clarity. They took me into a side room where I removed my clothes and put on a white garb. They blindfolded me, placed a linen lasso around my neck, and opened the doors to the main chamber. Almost immediately, I felt the air change. I believe the incense they burned was laced with something that drugged me, because I suddenly felt extremely heavy and on the verge of collapsing. A brother had to physically hold me up as we walked, and that detail alone tells me they knew exactly what was happening. They hammered loudly right next to my left ear while I was in that altered state, and I am convinced to this day that the sound caused permanent muscle damage and noticeable weakness on the left side of my neck. They delivered the usual symbolic warnings about keeping secrets, threats involving animals coming to pick out guts or eat hearts or ruin lungs, and they ended by charging me to go out and zealously spread Christianity, even though they had insisted they were not a religious organization. A Bible sat openly on the altar the entire time, and that contradiction has always stood out to me as proof that they are, in fact, Christian zealots operating under a false front. That same night, back in my luxury apartment where I lived alone, I lay down in bed and, for the very first time in my life, heard voices speaking inside my head. They sounded exactly like the Freemasons I had just met, and one of them said clearly, "Oh, he is an idealist." It was the first time I had ever experienced anything like it, and it shook me to my core. Only a week later, while I was still deeply depressed and had even bought a gun with the intention of ending my life, I decided instead to try methamphetamine as a final act of desperation. The delivery guy who brought it to my apartment said the moment he walked in, "I can't do this to you." He asked to use the restroom, closed the door, and somehow knew I had looked at his phone even though I had been quiet and the door was shut. When he came out, he wrote on my wall in clear letters, "Don't you worry your pretty little mind. People throw rocks at things that shine." Immediately after taking the drug, the voices exploded in volume and intensity. I began hearing pots and pans banging, loud noises, and far more voices than before. I drove out into the middle of Kansas with the gun still in the car. The voices argued back and forth. One told me, "Just do it," and reminded me of the trouble I had caused by telling my co-workers at Black & Veatch that I was a Freemason, while another said, "Put the gun down. We're sending someone for you." Moments later, a roadside assistance man appeared exactly as the voice had promised. He approached me cautiously, searched my bag, put me in the back of his truck, and turned on a small radio device that sounded as though it was tuning directly into me. It played demonic rap at first, and then switched to soothing, calming music. He looked at me and said only maybe when I told him I felt something bigger was happening. At the truck stop, the cashiers and staff messed with me and even hinted that I should steal a car that was sitting outside getting gas. When he drove me later, he purposely got the truck stuck in the mud and then revved the tires to get out, which felt like a symbolic act meant just for me. His dispatcher even knew I had thrown my phone away during a walk I took while waiting. On the way back home from the middle of Kansas, I was somehow led to a house. I went up to the door and saw a ghostly girl pointing at the handle. I turned it, but nothing happened. The drive home was filled with strange, unnatural storms that forced me to stop at a hotel. Eventually, I made it to my brother's house, and my family coordinated to get me into a psychiatric hospital. I have been hospitalized 7 times in total, including one stay in California. In one of those California hospitals, a psychiatrist offered me medications that had actually helped me years earlier when I worked at a law firm, but I turned them down at the time because there was an orderly out of the corner of my mind who shook his head no. I don't know why I said no. I was officially diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder along with major depressive disorder, anxiety, ADHD, and borderline personality disorder. I have always rejected the idea that this is simply mental illness. To me, it is clear that what I experience is not a chemical imbalance, but something far more deliberate. Practice on disenfranchised people, using psychic or wireless technology by Masons and other actors who target those society tends to overlook. They did not expect someone like me to have the family support and inner strength to push back. At one point, I worked at a gas station in Kansas. A coworker handed me a mop and said, "I just need a little." When I thanked him, he replied, "Yes," in a strange, knowing way and walked out. Customers constantly messed with me through their words, the change they gave me, and the items they bought. Later, I learned my manager had spiked my drink with alcohol, which only added to the long list of targeted incidents. I submitted paperwork to formally quit the Freemasons in 2019 or 2020. I received no official response, but it was placed on their agenda. Years later, I returned to the lodge, and one of the Masons looked at me and said, "I've heard you've had a couple of bad years." The way he said it made it obvious he knew far more than he should have. My father had spent years talking about the game, and once said on the phone, "He's changing the game." After he received a promotion, he began wearing fedoras every day and kept books about the mafia and Italian families he claimed to have done business with. My mother's ex-boyfriend, Charles Leon Slapper, who lives in Lansing, Kansas, is the man who once smeared feces all over a bathroom and blamed it on me. This is the same man who told me to enjoy the game. This is the same man whose voice sounds exactly like many of the voices I hear. This is the same man who became extremely defensive when I directly called him a spy. All of these pieces convinced me beyond any doubt that what I was living through was psychological warfare, possibly even connected to the themes in the movie Fight Club. From that realization forward, my entire life became dedicated to exposing and legally bringing down these evil secret societies.